It's like really, really cold, but I'm insisting on keeping my window open because I'm a dumbass, apparently. Hey, what's up? Welcome to this. So I've never done one of these deep dive things before. I usually do things on trends and overarching tropes and stuff, but the Phantom has come up a lot in my YouTube mentions and obviously my reading list, and I know I made my bed and I have to lie in it, and I didn't have to watch all of those movies, I chose to, but I just need to get something off my chest that has been bothering me. Phantom is a terrible human being and not romantic at all. Okay, like, I know that this is either a super obvious thing, like of course he's meant to be scary, or a weird thing to point out, like he's a tragic romantic hero who doesn't realize that his love for Christine and stalking is, you know, kind of creepy and scary, even if she is admittedly kind of into it. I know that's kind of meant to be it, and I know that there's also some weird self-insert shit with Andrew Lloyd Webber that I neither have the time nor the expertise to properly go into. But I can't help but feeling so weirdly disgusted that this is a thing. And no, I'm not talking about how Love Never Dies, like ruined all the character descriptions just to like shove Christine and the Phantom together. I'm talking about how the original musical is awful and creepy as shit. So quick disclaimer, I loved The Phantom of the Opera when I went to see it. And I'd go see it again a million times over, and I'm not a fan of Andrew Lloyd Webber, so this was kind of surprising for me. But my experience was kind of discolored by the fact that I found out certain intentions behind the musical or audience reactions after the fact. So let's start with my experiences of watching The Phantom, and you can kind of see where I'm coming from here. So I was really, really late to the Phantom of the Opera train. Like, for a high school theater kid, it's kind of embarrassing how late I was to the Phantom of the Opera train. I'd heard about it, and I'd seen like clips from the movie and the stage, like the concert musical thing, but I knew basically nothing about it. By the time I actually went to see it, which was a Christmas present from my friend's dad, which again, I cannot tell you how much I appreciate, I really only knew two things about the musical. The image of the boat going down to the lair, and the fact that people super shipped the Phantom and Christine. So I go to this musical, I have no idea what to expect, and automatically with the chandelier coming up above the audience, oh my god, like it was mesmerizing. And the music is great, we all know the music is great, and it was a really, really good time. But I don't know if it was the cost that I went to see or what, but I found no love story in text or subtext between Christine and the Phantom, and I was terrified of that character. Going into it knowing that people like super shipped them and that Love Never Dies like shoved them together, I was expecting this to be kind of a misunderstood love story sort of deal, but that is not what I saw. So I saw David Thaxton play the Phantom, I think, if the internet isn't lying to me, because I'm too poor to buy a program. But even my friend said that this was the scariest Phantom she'd ever seen. And again, I don't know if it was the fact that this guy was playing the Phantom, or if it was my history with stalking and harassment that I've talked about in an earlier video that was kind of already in my head, but this show really affected me. Like, I couldn't stop thinking about it for weeks. So it was terrifying. And like I said before, I never even noticed a romantic thing between Christine and the Phantom. And I know I've said a million times before that I wouldn't recognize chemistry if it slapped me in the face, but I didn't even feel sorry for him as a tragic character until literally right, like the very last 10 seconds of the show. Now flash forward, and I watched the Joel Schumacher movie for my stalking video, and I hated it. Like, all of the mystery was gone. So like the scene where the stagehand is murdered, in the show, we've heard the Phantom's threats, and we know something is wrong in this scene, and you're just waiting for something to happen. But all you get is the body just dropping from the ceiling, and until that moment, you don't realize how dangerous he is. In the movie, you watch him murdering the stagehand. It removes all the mystery and the intensity, and in the show, it's the scary thing is what you don't see. So in the movie, when they show it to you, it removes the suspense, it removes the fear. Same with the "All I Ask of You" scene, when you can see the Phantom hiding behind one of the statues on the roof. In the theater, I was squirming in my seat. I was like, there's no way that this guy isn't somewhere. And even still, when that Apollo's thing came up from like lower down, I figured it was just an interesting transition. And when he popped up, like it was horrifying. Like I don't know why in hindsight I didn't expect him to be there, but it caught me completely off guard. It lulled you into a false sense of security. But when you watch the "All I Ask of You" scene in the film, and it just keeps cutting to him hiding, and you know that he's there, that suspense, it's gone. And don't even get me started on that stupid as shit sword fighting scene. That doesn't make any sense, and I don't even know why it was put in there. But the biggest thing about this film, the biggest thing that I hated the most, was the sexual subplot between the Phantom and Christine. Yes, I know the subtext was there in the musical, and I know that maybe the Cost I Soul played up the scary stuff and played down the sexual stuff, but when I was watching this movie, it was disgusting to me that someone who literally murdered people was romanticized in such a way. So let's talk about that, shall we? TV Tropes calls this phenomenon Draco and leather pants. The idea is that you sympathize with these villainous characters and romanticize them in a way that you ignore all the bad things and you just focus on justifying their actions with sympathetic backstories, blah, blah, blah. One example is Tyler Durden, who becomes this for people who want to smash the system, or men who are trying to justify the uber masculinity that the film and the book both actively try to deconstruct. I mean, think about the cultural phenomenon that was Loki. How many times has Loki died? Like, I think it's legit up to 4 times now. And that doesn't even like include the get help sequences in Ragnarok. Like, they keep bringing this character back because Tom Hiddleston had such an effect on people. And yeah, he had a redemptive arc, and his villainy isn't really the super villainy that you get. And I guess if you saw Thor first and you were introduced to his backstory, then you would kind of sympathize with him more. But I was introduced to him during the Avengers, where he was just the villain, and his sympathetic side kind of caught me off guard when I went back and watched the other movies. Like, it did, but I get it. Tom Hiddleston is attractive, and so you make that more attractive to the audience. But then there comes a little bit of a problem with that, because then you end up with Steve in Stranger Things. I love Steve. He's one of my favorite characters, obviously. But in season 1, he was supposed to be what the writers called the human antagonist, someone who was not a monster, but still evil. But Joe Keery, who plays him, was just so likable that when they were filming it, they couldn't bring themselves to make him unlikable, and they redeemed him at the end. The first time I watched it through, there were things that I missed out on and was really confused and horrified at his redemption arc. Going back and rewatching the season, like I've done about 10 million times, I sympathize with him a lot more now than I did the first time around, but that's beside the point. This is why we get the character of Billy starting in season 2, but even he gets a redemption arc at the end, and people find Dacre Montgomery attractive. So you end up with characters who just become good because people have crushes on them, and that's a little weird. Same thing with Kylo Ren, because this is the one that confuses me the most. And I'm not a Star Wars fan, so maybe it's just like an outsider's perspective, but what the hell was going on with romanticizing Kylo Ren? Like, I get it. Adam Driver is attractive, but why would you put a guy who killed his own father and idolized Darth Vader in a romantic storyline with the protagonist? Hot male, hot female, love story. It doesn't make any sense to me. It's just like, I remember hearing about this when it happened, and I was just so confused. Why would they kiss? He's a Nazi? He's like a space Nazi? And like, What? Even he gets a redemption arc at the end, and I know for a fact that that has to be directly because Adam Driver is attractive. Like, that chemistry that he and Daisy Ridley had to be the driving force behind that, because I can't see any logical reason why that would have happened. Like, yes, people like Malfoy and Loki and sure, even Kylo Ren, you can find sympathetic backstories. Malfoy was shaped by his father into a bigot and a wizard Nazi. We have space Nazis and wizard Nazis and real Nazis in the world. You do see some of these sympathetic backstories, and with Malfoy and Loki and these people with redemption arcs, you can see the good guys getting through to them by the end, and, you know, they redeem themselves, they run away from the fight, or they sacrifice themselves for the sake of good, or whatever. But it's important to remember that an explanation is not an excuse. But this goes beyond the idea that attractive villains are given sympathetic backstories and redeemed. It's far beyond that. It goes into the romanticization of violent people. So let's talk about Ted Bundy. So for anyone who's been living under a rock, Ted Bundy was a serial killer who was active in the US between 1974 and 1978. He's probably best remembered for being attractive and charismatic, and he was even recently played in a movie by Zac Efron, which was actually pretty perfect casting if you ask me. He's pretty well known for women falling at his feet, and that being a big part of his cult of personality that he formed, and one woman, Carol Ann Boone, even married him. But that's not how the women who actually knew him remember him. Bundy's lawyer, Pauline Nelson, said that she pitied him, but that he wasn't particularly charming, and he wasn't even that smart. Anne Rule, who knew him before prison, called him a virtual non-entity. According to her, it was the media who took this guy, who admittedly isn't, you know, horrendous looking, and turned him into the charming killer we know today. Yes, he doesn't necessarily look like the person that we would peg as a serial killer, but the idea of him as a charming, charismatic guy is mostly a media fabrication. So this is where we get things like Natural Born Killers, which is a movie that specifically critiques the way the media romanticizes serial killers, but whose serial killer main characters are still held up as badasses. And more recently, Joe Goldberg. I love You. I really do. I loved the show. I think it takes a really interesting and unique perspective, and I read the book and I loved that too. But there's one thing about it that I find really troubling, and that's that people are in love with Joe Goldberg. And I don't mean that they find Penn Badgley attractive. I mean, a lot of people, including myself, can acknowledge that this man is aesthetically pleasing. No, they're in love with him. I won't quote any of the tweets here for privacy, but they're really, really easy to find if you want to. But they talk about how he's actually a pretty good boyfriend, apart from all the murder, and most famously, Millie Bobby Brown called him a hopeless romantic. They say if it were Joe, they'd be perfectly happy to be kidnapped and put in his murder box, or that they're fine with the murders that he does commit because he does genuinely believe that it was in the best interest of his love. Yes, Joe is a hopeless romantic, but he's also a deeply disturbed human being, and ignoring that aspect is something that I and Penn Badgley himself, as confirmed by the showrunners and his actual Twitter account following this whole Joe is great tweets, find deeply disturbing. There's a fairly notable trend of women falling in love with serial killers. Some of them are dealing with trauma themselves, others are in love with the idea that they can fix a broken boy, and others hold them up as a hypermasculine ideal. This all coming from a book by Sheila Eisenberg, which is still to this day the most comprehensive on the subject. According to her, and yes, I am about to beat this dead horse, the glamorization of violence in the media has something to do with this. When the media romanticizes outlaws, gangsters, and killers in true crime media, it draws people into this strange obsession. And then on top of that, social media and reality TV and even sensational news headlines use these killers as a way to sell things to people. So what does that actually mean? There's a reason people get so upset about Twilight and 50 Shades of Grey glamorizing toxic and abusive relationships. No, I'm not going to get into that here because there's so much else out there on the subject. But while Draco and leather pants can seem fairly harmless on its surface, why do people keep falling in love with people like Joe Goldberg? Showrunner Sarah Gamble thinks it has something to do with the patriarchal structures that we're exposed to, that we're conditioned to see romance as a good trait and hopeless romantics as heroes. Think about all these super creepy men that we hold up as romantic heroes. Edward Cullen, Christian Grey, Mr. Rochester, Heathcliff, Chuck Bass, Mr. Big, Joe Fox, Noah Calhoun, Mr. Darcy, and even the less overt ones like Ross Geller, who expect things from women without asking for their own opinions and desires. It's weird, but for some reason we keep flocking back to it. We keep seeing these weird toxic relationships in our books and on screen, and I literally don't have the time to go into all of those tropes and why they're coded as romantic. That would be a whole other video. But the problem with this narrative framing, this coding as romantic, is that we start to get used to it. If the media would stop spending their time talking about how attractive and charismatic Ted Bundy is, or would stop showing people like Christine being into that kind of behavior, we would stop seeing it as normal. And there's a problem with this kind of coding. Once it's coded as romantic once and it gets a positive reception, it gets coded romantic again and again until it becomes a trope in its own right. That's why things like watching people sleep and following them around for their protection are verified tropes in themselves now. I know this is pretty ranty, and it's pretty much based on how sick I am of people talking about how great Eric is and that his murders were totally not his fault. But the first time I saw this musical, he terrified me. I don't actually have an issue with people who fall in love with villains. It's like a thing, and I don't even have an issue with people who ship heroes with villains. It's just this trend that I've noticed of media creating stories that frame toxic relationships in a positive way to make you want to fall in love with those sorts of villainous and toxic characters. So when we get a character like Joe, when we get a character like Eric, who for all intents and purposes should be absolutely horrifying, we fall in love with them anyway. That's the thing that I find disturbing, that the musical itself wants you to fall in love with the murderer. They want you to see him as a romantic hero. That's where the concerning part comes in. And when these sorts of things are capitulated to, we get things like Love Never Dies, which is pretty universally hated, because that's not really what people want. But it is what the people who make these sorts of media, who rely on tropes for money, want you to want. And so as long as this media continues to exist, we're going to keep falling in love with characters like Joe Goldberg, who we're constantly told is not romantic and not a good person. But when that's all we know, what else are we expected to do? Phantom of the Opera is a great musical, but I think that one of the things that I found really problematic with the movie was how much it leaned into Christine capitulating his desires. And I know that when it was written, that was kind of the point, but I really appreciated the cost that I saw and the fact that it really played up the fact that the Phantom was actually horrifying and scary, and I hated him. But like I said, that's what made me think about it for weeks. I couldn't get this story out of my head. And I think that when you play it in that sort of way, you end up with a much more affecting story. Thanks for coming to my TED Talk. I'm gonna drink out of a dinosaur now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.